welcome everyone to today's session titled Building a Resilient Supply Chain. I'm Tom Goldsby from the University of Tennessee, and I'm pleased to welcome our guest, Mr. Zubair Amla. And Zubair is the Senior Sales Manager at Kerber Supply Chain. We reached Zubair today in Toronto, and he has extensive experience in working with clients in the warehouse management and technology domain. He's been doing so for more than 15 years, and particularly so with the application of advanced technological solutions and how they bear out in conversations with clients on the subject of supply chain complexity and resilience. So I think he's very well prepared to address us today and to take on any questions you might have. So welcome, Zubair. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for the introduction, and excited to be here.
Well, I'm going to turn things over to you in just a few minutes, but please allow me to go over a few details with our guest. First of all, maybe why are we here? What are we trying to accomplish? Well, this masterclass series, again, is dedicated to disaster mitigation. And there's no doubt that all of our supply chains are laden with immense amounts of complexity, and that complexity lends to high risk of disruption. So what we want to do is bring you best practices and innovative thinking from academics like myself, as well as insiders and senior leaders like Zubair. What are we trying to accomplish with the masterclass series dedicated to disruption management? Well, we want to provide guidance and insights to help you manage that complexity, and perhaps even turn your supply chains into a source of competitive advantage. Note that this is the lead-off session for the 4-class master class series, and we're going to continue over the next 2 weeks with the remainder of the schedule. Also note that we have a catalog of recently completed master classes that are also available to you on demand, and you can review any of these 5 master class series, each one consisting of 5 30-minute action-packed sessions dedicated to contemporary topics in supply chain management and advanced technologies. So with that, let's go over some housekeeping items. All of your phone lines are muted out there, so you don't have to worry about any potential disruptions you might have in the background of your home or workplace, wherever we find you today. We are recording the session, and the slides will be available to you within 48 hours. And again, we welcome your engagement in the session. If you have questions at any point during the presentation, please submit those questions through the questions tab in the GoToWebinar menu. Again, also in the GoToWebinar menu, locate that flexibility in WMS brochure that's available to you, compliments of Kerber Supply Chain. So we launched with a pretty simple, yet maybe challenging question. How prepared is your supply chain to handle disruptions? And so why don't we go ahead and take a look at the results of the poll. 45% of you indicated that your supply chain is moderately prepared, and that's I guess on the positive side of things. Somewhat and slightly came in at 18% each, with somewhat being our midpoint on the scale. So that's pretty encouraging to see that 45% of you are feeling perhaps like you've learned an awful lot over the past 8 or so months. You've navigated a lot of storms, I suspect, maybe some feast, maybe some famine on the inbound or outbound sides of your business. I'm really intrigued with the 9% of people that say that your supply chain is very prepared. I might want to identify who you folks are and invite you back for future sessions, because I think we can learn from you. But equally, 9% said not at all. So it's an interesting distribution we see around this question. And Zubair, maybe I'll throw it over to you just for a little bit of reaction to what you see in these results. Any surprises based on your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite surprised at the very and moderately, at least based on some of the research that I've done over the past few weeks on this topic. So it'd be interesting to see what organizations have done to prepare for these types of disruptions, and maybe we can learn from them as well too in real world scenarios.
No, absolutely, I agree. But yeah, it is interesting. It would have been very interesting to have conducted this poll probably monthly, if you will, over the past 8 months to see how things might have shifted. But hopefully you all are finding some steady legs under you and figuring out how to operate in this new normal, which is where we want to take the conversation. So if we can get back into the slide deck, appreciate that read on what you all are thinking and feeling. I'd like to just kind of frame today's discussion by looking back maybe a little bit pre-pandemic to how our supply chains were designed to function. And here you see the caption, ready, set, go. And this is the image of perhaps a 100-meter dash sprinter preparing to get into starter blocks to head down that straightaway to meet the finish line 100 meters later. And I think our supply chains have been to some extent designed for speed to develop processes that are free of hindrances, that are streamlined, not only within the four walls of our company, but also as they engage with customers and suppliers, as well as logistics service providers to perhaps thread our organization to our upstream and downstream partners in the supply chain. And again, when you're designed for speed, your goal is just to get down, it looks like maybe lane 7 here, as quickly as possible and try to break that tape before everyone else, get to market first, make sure you have the right product, the right place, right time, right quantity and condition to win the business. However, inevitably, if we go to the next slide, we see that straight line speed won't always win out. And we're in the throes of football season here in North America. It's good to see football back in action. Yeah, every now and then, maybe you can kind of break through that line, and then it's just a mad dash for the end zone to meet the destination and rack up 6 points for a touchdown. However, often there's going to be a defender, maybe several defenders there that get in the way, and maybe that straight line speed doesn't get the job done every time. Rather, you've got to pivot, maybe juke, put a move on, and perhaps even change direction to reach the destination. And I think that's what we've had to do quite a bit over the last 8 months. And so particularly what we've experienced the past 3 months or several months is unlike anything that we've experienced. It's not like a single defender out there trying to take us down. It's almost like the sidelines were emptied, and maybe even the referees were trying to take us down, or fans have come out of the stand to try to, it's like gang tackling that's been taking place on us. And so what we have to do is we got to figure out how to be more agile, more adept at changing direction. And if we go to the next slide, I'd like to just share a very simple observation that comes from a good friend of mine, Mr. Robert Martichenko, who offered this back in March, so pretty early in the pandemic. He observed that coronavirus has disrupted supply chains for 100% of U.S. companies. And I think it's certainly applies beyond the confines of the U.S., throughout North America, and even around the world. And this virus has disrupted lives and livelihoods. And what we have to be thinking about is, again, how to operate in the new normal, whatever it might present. And hopefully we will be on the far side of this pandemic. But there's no doubt that disruptions, risk factors are going to continue to introduce themselves, some that we've seen before and perhaps others that we haven't. And we're going to have to be ready for any and everything, and make sure that we continue to serve our customers as well as we can. So Zubair, what I'd like to do is transition to you. And certainly, as I said, disruptions and complexity are nothing new in supply chain management. But how is it that we can make sense of the risk and possibly be successful in mitigating them?
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate the introduction, and really, if we just go to the next slide, in today's globalized and interconnected world, any disruptions that we've learned during this global pandemic really has the potential to cascade through supply chains and affect other industries. Even though the global supply chain has become efficient, it's vulnerable to risks. We've seen supply chains that have been tuned for cost and speed. With modern management strategies and technology, But organizations are always looking at reducing operating costs, investing in lean manufacturing, just-in-time inventory, reduced product life cycles, and outsourcing, which have resulted in really highly efficient supply chains. This approach works well when there's no interruptions, and have yielded attractive business benefits to organizations that have invested in these types of strategies and technologies. However, what COVID-19 and the global lockdowns have taught us that it can really disrupt supply chains across the globe. And as a result, companies must elevate supply chain resilience to survive. And we're seeing companies innovating and be more agile in record time. We see car manufacturers in Detroit converting assembly lines to build ventilators. Breweries are altering production processes to manufacture hand sanitizers. Pharmaceutical companies are shifting research programs to find COVID-19 vaccines, and retailers are finding ways to virtually engage and sell to customers. And as I prepared for today's masterclass, I discovered outside of the Fortune 1000, many organizations, specifically on the small to medium-sized enterprises, were unaware of or ways to develop strategies to mitigate the impacts associated with disruptions and look at ways to building resilient supply chains. So I was quite intrigued by the poll question and the responses that we got based on some of the research that I saw outside of the Fortune 1000 on ways to mitigate some of those impacts and disruptions that we've seen, especially with this global pandemic. So as we move to the next slide, what are some of the things that, aside from this global pandemic, what are other causes of disruptions in our supply chain? And we've seen supply chains are subjected to more risk than ever, which are numerous and constantly evolving, that derive both from within an organization or even outside of a company. And avoiding such risks or reducing the negative effects is a challenge for many complex industries and specifically our supply chain industry that we all kind of revolve around. And risks associated to natural disasters like we're experiencing with this global pandemic. At the height or the beginning of that first wave, and many countries are kind of going into the second wave. Even companies like Amazon were experiencing supply chain related issues. It was 2 to 3 weeks backlog on sourcing inventory or even shipping orders, even for Prime customers. And I'm sure many of you subscribe to Prime. You've kind of seen the delay in getting orders to your door. And also, aside from natural disasters, accidents, wars, factors like currency fluctuations can certainly result in buying or selling power, which can disrupt the supply chain. Earlier this year, close to home for me, since I'm in Toronto, Canada, the disruption in rail service caused by the anti-pipeline protesters has a huge impact on some Canadian industries, costing millions and damaging Canada's reputation to, as a reliable supplier of goods. And the stoppage affected the movement of natural resources like timber, aluminum, oil, which impacted other industries. And at the same time, factories kind of faced a difficult decision on their ability to continue operations. So it goes kind of without saying that no supply chain is bulletproof. Organizations that have a well thought out plan to mitigate those risks and build resilience will help them achieve success and overcome some of these obstacles that cause disruption. And so when we kind of look at resilience and go to the next slide, the Webster Dictionary defines it in 2 ways. In material science, as you can see, resilience represents the ability of material to recover its original shape following a deformation. In the corporate world, resilience is referred to the ability of a company to bounce back from a large disruption. So, this global pandemic is obviously a clear example of kind of a bounce back from a large disruption. And that includes the speed at which it returns to normal performance levels, whether it's production, services, fill rates, etc. And companies can develop resilience in kind of 3 ways. It's either increasing redundancy, building flexibility, and changing kind of the corporate culture of an organization. And as it relates to supply chain, we'll discuss kind of building resilience to minimize disruptions and building flexible processes to perform at normal levels. So if we move to the next slide, you might be asking yourself, why build a resilient supply chain? Building a resilient supply chain can be attributed to managing risk. Many leaders view risk as kind of a negative, and risk management merely as a kind of a lever to protect value. Instead, companies can begin to think of risk as a strategic component, and if managed effectively, an opportunity to create value for the organization. And according to Garrett John, he's a VP at Gartner, he says most supply chain leaders recognize that becoming more resilient is a necessity in the current environment. However, measures such as alternative factories, dual sourcing, and generous safety stocks go against kind of the well-versed philosophy of lean supply chains that prevailed in recent decades. As we kind of move on to the next slide, we'll look at some of the reasons to build a resilient supply chain. There's a bit of a lag if we move to the next slide here. The implementation of these lean initiatives and single sourcing policies that we spoke of kind of help cut costs and improve efficiencies. They minimize risk and leave a supply chain with no spare capacity to cater for contingencies and therefore susceptible to disruptions. And to kind of get on top of these threats, you have to identify what your true risks are. After that, kind of transform some of the processes to help manage it and mitigate those risks. And those kind of help also build some barriers to entry. So if you look at some of the SWOT analysis, obviously you're looking at ways to create barriers to entry for your competitors and your competition. And building, I think, a resilient supply chain helps not only mitigate some of your risks, but also create additional barriers to entries for some of your competitors as they're entering your market. You also have to be prepared for the unexpected. If this global pandemic has taught us anything, things like diseases can travel across the globe in an instant. Airlines are investing in faster, more efficient ways for air travel, and as immigration continues to increase, more people are susceptible to traveling, between cities, countries, continents, and it results in a global pandemics and the likes that we've never seen before. So kind of rethinking from everything from selecting and doing business with a supplier, geography, transportation methods should be evaluated. And finally, through risk mitigation, you can kind of leverage some of the external data to gauge the likelihood of future disruptions. Building a resilient supply chain can also kind of be utilized to manage compliance, whether it's regulatory, tariffs, taxes, etc. As supply chains become increasingly complicated, many companies find themselves kind of requiring to comply with many rules and regulations. This might, some of these rules and regulations, many organizations don't even understand, let alone have the capabilities or resources to address them. So kind of keeping tabs on all these requirements can be overwhelming, especially when you add compliance to kind of a contract's terms and conditions that you're with organizations that you're doing business with outside your geographical boundaries. Last year we saw a tariff war like no other, whether it was a tariff on goods coming from China or sending to China, aluminum between Mexico, Canada, U.S., and kind of the revised NAFTA agreement. As we kind of continue to cross geographical boundaries, having to manage and comply with regulations in each region, including those that arise from a disruption, is even more critical as we look to building a resilient supply chain. I read an article in Glenn Yoke at Deloitte, who's a financial advisor and principal with their strategic and reputation risk practice. He's quoted as saying, one key issue is understanding the rules and regulations you actually need to follow. A lot of times businesses don't even know what they're supposed to comply with, which can be a recipe for disaster. Really, the ongoing volatility of supply, demand in the financial markets makes it even more important to build resilient supply chains and build them for cost performance. So as we move to the next slide, we'll kind of look at some of the strategies to build a resilient supply chain. In the Gartner report, Weathering Supply Chain Resilience in the Age of Disruption, they kind of outline strategies for building a supply chain resilience in this diagram that you see here. And in that report, they discuss how the rebalancing of efficiency, resiliency will not be easy, and in most cases, resilience comes with additional costs. So historically we look at supply chains and how do we make them more efficient and not necessarily adding more costs. But as we look to increase more resilience, it is going to come at a cost. But those costs of doing nothing can also be significant. And the report identifies these 6 major strategies that leaders can pursue to build greater resilience in their network. In a survey, 21% of respondents stated that they have a resilient supply chain network, and suggested that increasing resilience would be a #1 priority for them as they emerge from this pandemic. And many of the respondents expected highly resilient supply chains to be completed within the next 2 to 3 years. So we'll kind of dive into a couple of these things along with other strategies that we could consider looking at to build a resilience strategy. So when we look at the next slide here, excuse me, even as the world kind of begins to move forward towards planning for recovery, uncertainty, is kind of remain for the foreseeable future. We're all kind of seeing this second wave of this pandemic. So building supply chains to kind of withstand some of the volatility is going to be critical. So I'm going to focus on some of the areas and provide examples of where companies have built resilient supply chains and brought them into action. So when we talk about connected ecosystems and kind of thinking beyond the 4 walls of how you can better collaborate and innovate with your supplier, really the next gen supply chain model is what I consider kind of a network ecosystem or a connected ecosystem where suppliers, partners, manufacturers, distributors, and even retailers will have access to relevant cloud-based data to kind of make their best decisions based on real-time signals. As we see, supply chain companies and technology companies invest heavily in the cloud, that's going to give companies and these network ecosystems access to a lot more data going forward. And that connected network offers flexibility, either through kind of owning in-house or outsourcing some of those manufacturing capabilities and sharing that data amongst your suppliers and partners in that connected ecosystem. And that kind of falls in line with supply chain visibility, kind of predicting challenges and also responding quickly to some of those challenges. So improving your supply chain visibility with a planning function or better forecast and supply and demand will certainly help improve some of that supply chain visibility. So one of the key challenges for supply chain leaders during this crisis was kind of the erratic demand for goods. A demand for clothing obviously slipped as people were working from home. Folks weren't out, buying clothes, etc. While the demand for medical supplies or cleaning supplies, like disinfectants as we've seen, and groceries has certainly surged. And during the height of that initial lockdown, many of us experienced empty shelves in our local grocery store, even online. If you went to go look for something online, you saw a lot of stock out. So, some of the traditional forecasting models were less useful to predict these unusual demands and slumps. So businesses kind of must quickly learn how to recognize some of these demand signals and forecast accordingly to avoid some of these overstock and stockouts. And visibility across the supply chain is critical to making decisions in how to restart lines, prioritize products, manage relationships with our suppliers, as companies tend to focus on their own operations, potentially risking some of the relationships with their tier 1 suppliers, and that's no longer enough because of some of the erratic demands signals that are likely to persist over some time. Companies will need to kind of monitor market and economic indicators, as well as external data sources such as financial and commodity indexes and government data spaces, or even social media feeds. I think can certainly provide some of that visibility and ahead of the curve insights into the demand picture that you'll see going forward. So COVID-19 and some of these significant disruptions that really have revealed the interconnectedness of supply chain, and one decision can affect many others. So companies will kind of have to look at analytics and supply chain intelligence tools to improve some of that visibility from end to end in terms of their total supply chain and thinking outside of their four walls of the warehouse. Multi-sourcing or Gartner, if you saw on the previous slide, refers to even some of the neo-shoring, can kind of go hand in hand. And the lack of diversification and sourcing strategies, created during this global crisis really came to fruition here, right? So one of the questions that often comes to mind is, will this pandemic drive companies to contemplate moving away from globalization? I think it's unlikely, but many organizations will kind of reevaluate some of the risk of putting all their eggs in one basket. Do I source everything from China? Do I source everything from some Asian, from overseas? Or do I bring some of that supplier in closer to my geographic home base? And that might seek a balance between kind of local and global procurement, right? So some may try to pull the sourcing or manufacture closer to their homes. And all this really implies that there will be an interest in diversification of sourcing strategies, whether you find companies in a specific region or kind of diversify it across multiple geographic regions. If you recall, in 2011, a major natural disaster in Japan and Thailand disrupted kind of the global supply chain, exposed a lot of some of this in the automotive industry. So Honda's assembly plant, for example, which is a critical node in the supply chain, was flooded out of operation for 6 months in Thailand. And this example kind of shows you the loss that a factory that you basically have a factory that produces a unique component or part, plays a critical role in the supply chain, and what can happen as a result of disaster. In contrast, Nissan, for example, recovered within weeks because what they had done was diversify their supplier and invested in some alternative sources. And this is just kind of one example of how multi-sourcing could certainly help increase some of the supply chain resilience and respond to a disaster. In response to kind of the US-China trade war, many organizations kind of realigned themselves for looking ways to diversify their sourcing and manufacturing bases, right? Which meant switching to new suppliers outside of China, or asking some of the partners that may have been in these regions to, look at factories in Mexico, which were, closer to, when we talk about the U.S., Mexico obviously being closer to the U.S. And according to a survey done back in March from the National Association of Manufacturers, 53% of manufacturers anticipated a change in their operations, while 78% anticipated a financial impact, and 36% were facing supply chain disruptions due to COVID. So really, beyond multi-sourcing, some companies are going to want to reduce some of those geographic dependence in their global networks and shorten the cycle time for finished products so that they can get, their goods to their customers faster by reducing some of that geographical dependence. And really, as our listeners have learned from COVID-19, having flexible supply chains and companies, expanding your geographical footprint will help you minimize some of those risks of disruptions in the times of disruptions. And last but not least, information technology, which is near to dear to my heart. It requires investing in technology and advanced analytics really to help improve supply forecasts and increase accuracy to help some of that efficiency. So leveraging technology to pull data from internal, external sources, whether it's social media, to spot some of the trends can certainly be beneficial. In the application of IT within supply chain, as we've all noticed, has obviously increased dramatically. So if planned and implemented correctly, IT can have a significant impact in resilience through various channels, whether it's analytics, data, information sharing, scenario modeling, and really the foundation, is building that resilient supply chain. And a good example was that with Boeing, to address some of their supply chain issues that delayed their 787 production by 3 years. It resulted in 217 canceled orders, and they estimate about a $6 billion in loss in profits. So what they did, the company kind of engaged their suppliers in what they considered a collaborative planning, forecasting, or replenishment exercise, and they termed it CPFR, if I recall correctly. And what they did, their IT systems were integrated to allow real-time data exchange between their suppliers and their manufacturers. So Boeing sent weekly forecasts and inventory counts to their suppliers from their ERP systems that in turn generated electronic purchase orders for raw materials. And that kind of helped improve some of the forecasting, and it enabled Boeing suppliers to adjust its production process to maximize its efficiency. So, having that enhanced communication really was part of Boeing's supply chain to ensure some of that disruption that would occur, and investing in technology to help minimize some of those risks. Going forward, I think we're going to see a lot of investment in things like AI, artificial intelligence, or machine learning, which can certainly help, I think, drive some of that collaboration across supply chains by potentially identifying disruptions early, or allowing for supply chain resources to come together and respond efficiently or quickly as part of some of these national mitigation strategies. So really, to conclude, as a supply chain leader, as you look to help organizations transition kind of to the next phase of this pandemic, thinking beyond the four walls and what the implications have are certainly going to be top of mind for a lot of supply chain leaders. And key decisions will need to be made around whether supply chains should be optimized for cost, speed, agility, or innovation. And that innovation might be, how do we connect our ecosystems? Do we look at investing in technology to increase supply chain visibility? Do we look at investing in diversifying our suppliers or our partners that we do business with to cover multiple geographies or regions, or do things like nearshoring, where we have either local manufacturing plants or suppliers that can certainly help bring some of those finished goods to market? So really, I think what we're going to see is supply chain leaders will learn and thrive in this midst of this disruption, and what COVID-19 has certainly taught us, that having that agility and the variety and the innovation is certainly going to be top of mind for a lot of these supply chain leaders.
Excellent, Zubair. Thanks so much for those observations.